Now we join Kids Comics editors Wendy, Megan, Whitney, Kiara, and Rose. Wendy is wearing white headphones and surrounded by cool travel posters for science fiction locales. Megan is wearing glasses and sitting in front of some comfy gray pillows. Whitney has teal hair and is sitting surrounded by shelves and shelves of books. Kiara has curly pale purple hair and is wearing a Sailor Moon t-shirt. Rose is wearing a black shirt and has their short hair pulled back. Wendy will be facilitating a conversation about working as an editor in kids' comics.
Hi, and welcome to Geek Girl Con, and we're talking behind the scenes in kids comics, and we have a bunch of editors here. So first of all, can I get you all to introduce yourself? Let's start with Megan.
Hi, I'm Megan Peace. I'm an editor at the Graphics Imprint, which is part of Scholastic. There's more I can share.
Well, if you want to chat quickly about how you got into that role.
Sure. I was initially hired at Scholastic as an editorial assistant, and I was hired to support on Dave Pilkey's publishing. Of all people to get to work with, it was such an honor to work with him. And as I was there, I got to add more responsibilities to my plate and eventually start acquiring my own projects. So I really grew up at Scholastic. My entire career has been there.
Awesome. Whitney?
I'm Whitney Leopard, and I'm the senior editor at Random House Graphic. We're an imprint of Random House children's books. I got into editing comics. I went to art school to major in sequential art because I knew I loved comics, and then I discovered editorial was a job. I got an internship outside of college, which led to a job at Boom Studios, where I worked, and I ran their kids imprint Kaboom for a while. And then 2 years ago, Gina Gagliano reached out to me to join her team at this new imprint she was launching called Random House Graphic, and that's how I ended up here.
Awesome. Rose?
Hi, I'm Rose. I'm an associate editor at Harper Alley, which is HarperCollins Children's Books' new graphic novel imprint. And so I started, I got a degree in publishing from Emerson College, and I got my first publishing job working as an administrative assistant in the children's department of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. So which was a great entry point to publishing, I think, for somebody who didn't know that much about it, because, you see it from a really holistic point of view. And then I moved to New York and got a job as an editorial assistant at Harper, where I worked on picture books and early readers. And then on licensing for a while, and then I've been in this position now. Harper Alley's been around for maybe a year and a half, and I've been at Harper Alley for about a year.
Fantastic. And finally, Kiara?
I'm Kiara Valdez. I am an assistant editor at First Second. And I've been with First Second for 4 years since I graduated college. I knew I wanted to be an editor since I was 16. So I was just doing a bunch of internships in publishing, and I knew I wanted to do comics. So with a lot of hard work, and luckily I got into First Second and have just been building my career through First Second. It's my home, and I hope it's my home for a long time.
Awesome. Okay, so for people who really don't know what an editor does, I want you to give me a little bit about your day-to-day. So let's start with you, Whitney.
Yeah, so I feel like my day-to-day ends up being answering a lot of emails, talking to a lot of people, a lot of paperwork, and that's just the business side of things, where I feel like I'm constantly just filling out things or responding to people. But the fun part of the job is when I get to collaborate and talk with creators about their book, whether they've submitted script or art, and get to talk to them about, the process, notes, feedback, and, the next steps in the process until we can get that final book in stores.
Would you all kind of agree that that's sort of those emails? I keep hearing a lot about those emails, you spend a lot of time on those emails.
Yes.
Rose, or would you like to?
I was just gonna say, I think that at least at Harper, my experience is that the editor is really a point of contact for all of the different departments about the book. So you end up having getting pulled into a conversation with design or into a conversation with marketing, or you're always in contact with your authors. But then the other thing that I think is really cool about the job of editor is that the sort of rolling basis that publishing works on, is that we can be like, in a given week, I could be working on an outline for one project, but also be like putting the finishing touches on a different project. So you get to kind of every single day be working on like at any sort of point in the process. And I find that really exhilarating.
Yeah, I call us the jack of all trade. It's because we just have to be in touch with every process of the book, and we are there the whole way. But it is a lot of emails. I people find it really funny that I'm like, yeah, I don't get to edit during my 9 to 5 editing job. I usually do it at like 8 p.m. to some ridiculous time because I'm just answering emails and filling paperwork all day long. I'm trying to fix that. Trying to have a reading day, which editors know never works out because you never end up reading on your reading day. But yeah, it's a lot of emails, but the fun part is definitely the editing, the collaborating, the finding new talent, all that stuff.
Megan, do you have anything you want to add?
Just to say that each day is completely different from the last day or the next day. Like, and any given week, it's so different. I have never had a typical day or a standard day. It's just different. And then the plans that I have at the beginning of my day are never the plans that I have executed by the end of the day. So it's just always, it's a great job if you're someone who like thinks on the seat of your pants, like you're quick on your feet. And so it's great. And it's exciting that way, that there is no redundancy, that it's creative every single day with different areas of creativity. As Rose was saying, like working on different parts of the manuscript at any given point, like you're utilizing creativity in so many different ways. So it's fun. It's great.
Awesome. So we do want to kind of focus specifically on kids comics. So my question for you is, if you've worked on other kinds of books, what's the difference in the mindset when you approach kids comics editing? Let's start with Kiara.
I have only done kids comics.
Well, there you go.
Only been in this for 4 years. I've only done kids comics. I mean, I've helped with some adult, but so I guess I can talk a little on that. I think it's not harder, but you have to remember your audience. Like, all of us are much older than the kid age. And as much as kids comics, YA, and middle grade are my favorite things to read, there are sometimes that you have to step back as an editor and say, would a kid find this funny? Would like a kid find this relatable? I often talk about my younger self. It's always like referring back to like that point in time when I was 12 through 17. And thinking, what was I thinking then? What was I finding like nice to look at and funny at that time?
Megan?
I have edited only children's books, but I have edited some novels, though, which is different than a graphic novel. It's just different. I think with something that I appreciate more about editing graphic novels is that I enjoy diving into a story, not only with my imagination of how I'm envisioning like the story, but actually seeing like physically the artist's interpretation of the story, which is it just brings so much life and dimension to the story when you can visually see what the author is intending for you to see. So that's to me a lot more enjoyable in my experience than just reading words on a page. Like the process of routing material is much more enjoyable for a graphic novel.
Rose?
I've also only edited kids. But I was gonna say, I think that when I feel I used to edit licensing books for kids, and that was a really, really different experience in terms of but also just kind of maybe from a bookmaking perspective was really different because you are working with licensors and TV studios as opposed to with creators who have their artistic vision, but that's not really an age demographic thing, though I do have a lot of I find it really, really challenging to toggle between working on YA projects and books for much younger readers. So I'd be curious to hear about anybody else who's had a lot of experiences working across the age gamut in kids' books.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
I mean,
Go ahead, Whitney.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, again, also my focus has always been kids comics, so it's just oh no. But I feel like the one thing was my previous job was very direct market focused, so focused on comic shops and single issues, where they focused more on the adult readers, so the kids imprint I felt like I spent majority of my time when I worked there was convincing people not to talk down to children. And so that was like majority of my experience was just like kids are smarter than you actually think they are. And then to then like now come over to a publisher where like I work now in like a kids imprint where it's just like, oh no, like kids are smart and here's all this stuff. And then I feel like now it's the other stuff where it's like I have to go back being like, all right, will a 12-year-old actually find this funny? Will a 10-year-old actually find this funny? I think it's hilarious, but like, you know, it's different there. But I think toggling between YA and like maybe one of my younger middle grade books, I do have some hard times because there's some stuff where I'm like, but this is accurate for both age groups because people have different experiences, but then what puts it in the YA space versus what puts it in the, like, still makes it appropriate for a younger space. And I think that's something that ends up being a conversation about like the book that you end up having with like the creators in your team to make sure you're fitting the audience.
Awesome. Okay, so you all clearly love what you're doing. I want to know what it is you love about graphic novels in general, but specifically also your kids and YA graphic novels. Let's start with Rose.
I don't know. I think that the thing about graphic novels specifically that I love to delve into is just sort of the moment. Like I think that there's you know such a you can slow down so much in graphic novel storytelling, and so much is told through visual details. And I think that is something that I return to again and again in terms of the storytelling, is sort of like the different sort of tools that you use to tell a story visually versus when you're telling a prose novel story. Like I think that like I love the little tiny teeny details in the art that can convey so much about a character or so much about a moment, or so much about a dynamic between two people. I think that that's like the thing that is like really delicious to me. And then your second part of the question was about kids specifically. I mean, because that's sort of the same. I think like same answer, but the joyfulness of children's visual storytelling I think is really cool. Like so much of it has to do with humor and like diving into what it's like for that kid character to like what makes them tick, and seeing that on the page, that feels really joyful to me. That is what I really love.
Kiara, what about you?
Oh man, that's hard. So in general, I'm a pretty slow reader in life. So I've always leaned towards comics since very little. I'm a huge manga reader. And growing up that way, I love that I just would pause at pages for forever. I would just stay there and just keep absorbing information. And I just think graphic novels have so much to give, especially to people that are more reluctant to reading, like I was when I was younger. And I just think it gives so much in the way that it combines art and storytelling in a way that, as much as I do love some novels, I always prefer reading graphic novels and manga because of that. And for kids, I live in nostalgia. I'm all about those feels. Like, so I'm always reading kids comics because I just wish so much that's out right now was there when I was younger, specifically on the queer side and a lot with representation. I just didn't have these kinds of things, especially in the American market, which is why I leaned so hard on manga when I was little. So I know my heart. I just feel I have so much joy when I, in New York Comic Con, see a kid pick up a book, because I just think about how lucky they are to be in the time we are now.
Megan?
For me, I really love how the art in a graphic novel can punctuate a moment with just the art, no text, that I feel that a prose novel can't execute as well. You have that moment to, like, I think kind of Rose was alluding to this, that you have a moment to pause on something, let the moment settle, let it simmer with the reader. And the art says it all. So that I think that's something that graphic novels pull together very nicely. So that for me is one of like the highlights, the ways that obviously, you know, the art and the text are telling stories, but I love how independently on their own they're also telling a story. Like they work together so beautifully, but they also bring their own force independently to a story. That's really enjoyable for me.
Whitney?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I agree with what everyone said so far, because it's like the craft of it, how a graphic novel is like made, but then also because I feel like that was my first thing whenever I like when I finally picked up like my first comic. I remember like looking at it and being like, but how did this happen? Like, because I understood art and I understood stories, but I didn't understand how they could like come together so seamlessly. And and thus I'm an editor. But like, it's one of those things where I fell in love with like the craft of like how they all come together and how that happened. But just art as a whole, and I very much agree with like what Kiara said, where it's just like my small hometown, the comic shop was also the porn star, so like I didn't get to see comics until we had a Barnes and Noble move in, which like to show you how small my town was, like we did not have a Barnes and Noble move in until like I left that town and we moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. Like we moved to a place that had bookstores versus vice versa. So it's one of those things being like, until I had access to more books, comics weren't something that they were something that was viewed as like, oh, for older readers, typically for older male readers. And it was just like, that's not what you should be reading. You should be reading, The Hatchet and whatever's on your school reading list, and let's just stick to that. And so seeing the amount of stories that are out now and the amount of just content that kids have, I'm like both insanely jealous and just so excited because we get to create more and more of that.
Well, that's something I'd love to touch on and circle back to what Kiara had said about how wishing you had the comics that you see now back when you were growing up. So if you can pick one or two titles that you really wish you could have read when you were a child. Let's start with Megan, or a young adult.
For graphic novels, one that came out this past year that I have been obsessing over is Go With The Flow. I don't know if anyone's read it, but I was just like, I wish I had this book handed to me like before I turned 12. I just think it would have been so informative on so many levels. I can't think of a second one on like in this very moment, but that one for me, like without a doubt, that's my instant when I think about which book I had when I was growing up. It's that book.
Rose?
Yeah, one of many for me would be The Witch Boy by Molly Ostertag. I feel like that's such a great story about a boy who, in a setting where all girls are witches and boys are werewolves, he realizes that he's a witch, and the exploration of that, I feel like, would have been really, really interesting to me as a younger reader, and like and I think it also just like is a great showing of like interior character development and like exciting action magic stories that I think like seeing that those things can exist together in a book for young readers is like really, really awesome to me.
Kiara?
For me, it has to be YA. I toggle between The Beloved, Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me, and Kiss Number 8 for either of them, because I came out really late in life, didn't know about it, and I feel like I would have known if I had books to read earlier on. So definitely between those two.
Whitney?
Yeah, I feel like I toggle between two as well, where it's This One Summer and then the more recent The Prince and the Dressmaker, where like this one summer had a lot of like serious conversations happening around these two girls, where I think if I had that as a kid, I would have been like, oh, so it's normal that serious stuff happens to kids, and it's not just like fun adventures that it's all hunky-dory, because I felt like so much stuff happened and it was just like, but all the stories I read are happy. Why is this happening? And then with The Prince and the Dressmaker, to have like this book, I felt like it gave you so much space to have conversation about identity, but then also relationships between like different people and parents, that I felt like, I mean, I cried when I read that book, and I feel like I would have like sobbed like again as a young child if I had had it earlier on in life.
Okay, so as editors, what makes a book really stand out for you? Like, when you're looking through for pitches for all these ideas, or when you're working on a book, what just makes you go, wow? Let's start with Kara.
You saw me thinking the
Sorry, I
hardest,
saw
and then you picked me.
you.
Oh, that's so hard. So for me, it's really hard to explain like the spark that makes me. I'm very visual, so I get the art is really important for me. But then there's also a sense of just knowing your story. That is really hard to explain to people. It's like a lot of people who like when they send a good pitch, most of it is like that person knows exactly who they can like visualize the person this book is going to land, like the market, and not in the sense of like talking big words like the market. They just have a good self-awareness, and it comes through in many different ways, but it comes through in the pitch, and it like immediately pulls you in. And I'm talking in super meta terms, but it's really hard to explain what exactly drives me into like a story. But it's the kind of thing where you read and you're like, I want more of this, because you're so sure of what you're telling.
Megan?
For me, I think art is number one. If the art speaks to me, then I think that if there are maybe areas in the story that aren't ideally what I, had been keeping an eye out for or something, I feel like stories can always be shaped, but the art is the art, and like that's what you see is what you get kind of with art. And someone who has a unique style, someone who in both writing and in their art. If someone has like distinct voices for their characters, that's really enjoyable too. If someone writes funny, that's another incredible thing that stand out to me, because you can't teach someone how to write funny. That is an innate talent. So things like that are things that stand out to me. Other things that can be finessed into a story or worked on in a story, I wouldn't necessarily let that keep me from moving forward on something if it had, in any given case, like if it was a funny story that I was working on. So if it had like true humor, great art, great voices for the characters, like other things wouldn't keep me from moving forward if it had those elements in place.
Whitney?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, working graphic novels, all of us are going to be like, art is very important, which art is very important. But I feel like when it comes to story, it's that element that like pulls you in. But I feel like something that I tend to focus on is the characters, and like, are the characters strong characters? Because I feel like sometimes I'll get a pitch in which the person's trying to sell me the world and not necessarily the characters who are in the world. And I'm like, but the characters are who we're going to read about. And like, this world might be very exciting, with whatever like politics are happening in the background, but that's not what the story's going to be about. The story's going to be about following, character A and B, as they go on this trek to find character C. Like, they need to be strong characters, and they need to stand out, and they need to like grab me in some way, in a way that like, so that I can present it forward, being like, I know the readers who are going to pick this up because they are also going to want to follow these characters. So that tends to be like art, and then characters are more of a focus for me.
What about you, Rose?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Whitney. I think that the thing that sticks out to me is like, do I want to go with this character on this journey? And like, and it's sort of like, what is this character's voice, and does it stick with me, and does it feel real, like a real person? And I think there's something a little bit about like, do I root for this character? That also is a question that I ask myself. And like, not that I don't love a good anti-hero, but I think that like, if you're going to be spending 200 or so pages with this person, and do you really care about seeing them try to overcome what obstacle they're about to go through, I think is what is the most compelling to me.
So let's go kind of the opposite route, and I'm going to ask you what your pet peeves are when you get some. What do you want to tell people? Like, don't do this, please. Let's start with you, Whitney.
Okay, I have two pet peeves. One, if you're bad at lettering, don't letter. It's better to like have in the sample pages with the script written out next to it and not have lettering than to have like really bad lettering. Because I mean, granted, like if it's something that I'm really in love with, then like I will hop on the phone and talk to the person, being like, you're not going to letter your book. Like, sorry, we're just taking that off the table. But but it can be distracting. So like when it comes to pitching, like you want to make sure you're putting your best foot forward. Like sometimes it's better not to letter if you're not good at it. And then the second thing is when people tell me how I'm going to feel about a book. Like, this book is going to be a gift to your list. Like, this book's going to be the most amazing book you have ever read. Like, you're welcome for sending it to you. I get, like, messages like that sometimes, and I'm sitting here going, like I highly doubt it's going to be the best book I've ever read, but, like, it better be in order to, like, endorse this thing that you're telling me how I'm going to feel about it. I would rather the person, whenever they send the pitch over, say how they feel about it, like, why they think it's an important book and why they think that it should, be with me or be at Random House Graphic whenever they send it over.
What about you, Megan?
I'm trying to think of like pet peeve exactly, but when I'm looking at like a submission, and kind of like when an agent will send something through in a pitch, like how positioning it as like something really, really unique. And then as I'm reading through it, I'm like, I'm not picking up on these points that you're highlighting in here. And if it's like a fantasy book in particular, like I'd love to see something that's really, really stand out about that fantasy. Kind of like what Whitney was saying, like she's trying to be sold on the world, but you need to do more than sell me on a world. Like what is the special hook for this kind of story? So I feel like, receiving a submission that maybe doesn't have it's not ready for submission kind of thing. That's more of a pet peeve, that it needs some work. Or I've also received submissions from agents and I'm like, this is an interesting concept, but here's like some feedback. And they're like, oh, that's a really good idea. Like, oh, maybe I should have like sat with this for a little bit longer before sending it out on submission. So sometimes with that, I'm kind of like, put a little bit more effort in up front, and then I'd be more than happy to take a look at it. So sometimes I feel like people are just in a rush something over to an editor where they're not necessarily putting in the time to finesse it for submission.
Kiara?
Oh man. I guess one of the ones I would say is someone, I mostly get agented submissions, but getting an illustrator that is obviously didn't do sequentials or practice sequentials before they submitted is a pet peeve of mine, because I need agents and a lot of people to know that, like, just because someone can draw amazing illustrations does not mean they can draw sequentials. And it's like extremely obvious when you see like pages done by an illustrator that has not practiced any of their sequentials, just how stiff things are from one panel to the other. It just looks like still images pasted. And if they just practiced more, gave it like 6 months, a year before they dove into sequentials and gave it, I guess, a little more respect than that. It's a learned skill. Just because you can draw doesn't mean you can draw a comic. I would be much happier.
Rose?
I've got two, I think. So good graphic novels are kind of trendy right now, I would say. And so I think that a lot of some proposals come and the book was clearly originally conceived of as a prose novel and they want it to be a graphic novel now. And that's a pet peeve of mine, because I think that like there's a very good reason to make something a graphic novel and there's a very good reason to make something a prose novel. And sometimes like there's amazing adaptations out there, obviously, but I think like 9 times out of 10, like there's a good reason to set something in the medium that you've set it. And then my other pet peeve would be this is going to be the next Dog Man. I think I hear it a lot.
Okay, keeping on with pet peeves, I'm gonna kind of pull back to be more general. What is your pet peeve about the perceptions that we have about comics, that others might have about comics? The negative perceptions, and what kind of pet peeves just really, really get you? Let's start with Whitney.
Oh, man. I feel like whoever decided that comics are the way to get your movie made, so pitch it as a comic first, which kind of goes into like the prose novel pitch that Rose was talking about. Like, if you want your story to be made into a movie, you should probably be pitching it to Hollywood. Don't come up to me and be like, I have something that's going to make you millions of dollars once Hollywood buys it. And I'm sitting here going like, I don't care about Hollywood. I am literally a graphic novel editor. Like, pitch me the book. I don't care about any of this other stuff. And granted, you know, and I know there are companies that do, but like that is not what I care about. And so that tends to be something that gets on my nerves when that's like an approach. I'm gonna pass it on as I try to think of more things.
Well, hop back in if you have more ideas, but we'll go to Rose.
Yeah, we could definitely, I mean, we're all people who love graphic novels here, so I think that we'll all agree that people not thinking of graphic novels as real storytelling is a long, pervasive conversation that we could have. But more specifically, I've noticed that people seem to, like, obviously that conversation is changing, which is great. But a lot of people seem to still think that educators and librarians like are anti-comic, which has just never been my experience in any educator or librarian I've ever talked to. And I think like that's a really bummer misconception, is that like educators and librarians are like so on the forefront of talking about comic storytelling as a like valid medium. So that bothers me.
Kiara?
I think that a lot of us in comics, specifically graphic novels, live in a bubble. And I was not in this bubble before literally a year before I graduated college. So I think a lot of people still think of comics as DC and Marvel, which just drives me insane. But I feel for them, because I used to be one of those people. That's why I used to love manga so much, because I didn't see at the time the same kind of stories being told in those ways in American markets, which is a lie. They've been here all along. I was just not, I just didn't come across them in my library search and things like that. But I would love it if this blows up. It continues to become more and more mainstream, and people realize that there's so many comics out there that are not DC and Marvel, and there's something for everyone. That is a dream.
Megan?
Maybe about how a graphic novel is very quick to read, because I think that it's important to sit and take your time with a graphic novel rather than racing through. Sure, there aren't as many words in a graphic novel as there would be in a prose novel, where it might take you days, weeks to read a prose novel. It could take you a matter of hours if you just raced through a graphic novel to finish it cover to cover, but you need to take your time with it. You need to pause. You need to read the art in addition to the words.
I hate when people tell me how long it took them. They're like, it took me, I sat down, read this in 2 hours. I'm like, don't tell me that. That took 4 years to make. I don't want to hear it. Like, it really hurts me.
I think I'm okay. I'm okay with them reading it fast, because I feel like I've also heard that people
They reread it
more.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, you know, it's fine if you read it fast as long as it lives on your shelf longer than your other books, where like you read it once and then like it collects dust and you eventually gift it to a friend being like, oh yeah, I read this, it was great. As long as the graphic novel stays with you, I think that'll be that's what I like.
Okay, comics versus graphic novels. Do you have issues with how the public kind of perceives those two words? Kara, I saw did that look like a deep sigh?
Yeah,
All
it's
right.
more like a deep sigh, and like things like ask myself every day kind of thing. It's like an inner turmoil, because when I came into this industry, I very adamantly said graphic novels instead of comics, because it's just, when you have a part of the industry, floppies and things like that, that like kind of rejects what you do, I was being rebellious. I'm like, okay, then we're different. Then we're graphic novels, and it is what it is. But in the last few years, with a lot of change happening in the industry, a lot of conversations happening, I use them interchangeably. I do lean more to graphic novels. I feel like to like the everyday person, because I feel like if I say comics, they will think DC Marvel. That is mainly why I choose graphic novels over comics. But recently, I definitely do use comics and graphic novels interchangeably, because I want it to be more of a cohesive industry instead of us fighting each other all the time.
Megan, do you have anything to add to that?
I think generally I might say like, oh, comics community, but if I'm preparing something for acquisitions, I'll say this graphic novel rather than this comic. But I do make a distinction regularly, but sometimes I guess I just make a broad use of comics.
What about you, Whitney?
Yeah, I feel like because I also came from working with single issues, so I feel like whenever I'm talking about, usually when I talk about comics, I talk about like comics as like a whole, and so comics to me is more all encompassing. Whereas like when I'm talking about the single issues, I say single issues, and if I'm talking about graphic novels, I'll talk about graphic novels. And then if I'm talking about like single issue collections, I'll either call them collections. Like I feel like I will try to be specific for all because I come from like all those. I work with all those different types of people to be as specific as possible, so there is no confusion. But typically, I use comics as a more all-encompassing word, and then get more specific with the others.
Rose?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add to that. I think that like it depends on who you're talking to and what they're going to hear when you say it. And I think, like Kiara was saying, like a lot of people outside of publishing might hear comics and think that I'm talking about DC or Marvel. And the only other like distinction I would make is that I think I use them really interchangeably, and that I use like comic storytelling. Like if I'm talking about craft, I think I would more likely say comic storytelling than graphic novel storytelling, since it's more, I think it's a better umbrella term.
Okay, let's circle back to the education aspect and comics in the classroom and in libraries. How do you feel about the access that kids have now to that? Like, how does it make you feel to see, you know, maybe a kid picking up your books that you've worked on? Megan, let's start with you.
I can't tell you how many times I have ridden the subway home or walked around the street and have seen a kid with a copy of Dogman in his hands. And for me, that is the most heartwarming thing ever. It's to see the look on a kid's face reading through that. Like, I feel that joy having like worked on the books, but like in my heart, I can only imagine like how the author must be feeling about that. Like anytime he sees a kid with it. So it is just, it's like the icing on the cake. It's almost just like the thank you card, the high five, the pat on the back for like a job well done, to see a child in action enjoying a book that you've worked on.
Rose?
Funny because so like Harper Alley's pretty new, like our first like real major wave is like coming out this fall, but in general I think I feel like stage fright when I see this. I think that like there's no more honest critic than a child, and I think that like they're like not my mom, they're not going to say like nice try, like, so I think that like it's like a very, you know, it's humbling. And like, I think that a child reader is like not going to, you know, save your feelings. Like they're going to tell you how they like it. And I think that that's like a very frightening position to be in, personally.
Whitney?
I mean, I agree with what Rose said. Just my nieces who are like in the prime age of the audience that we aim for, they're both like the biggest comic fans and also like the cruelest critics sometimes when it comes to like the books. And it's not even like I'll be like, oh, this is so exciting, like here's a New York Times bestselling book, like you should read it, I hope you enjoy it. And they'll like open it and be like, but it's not as good as this book. And I'm sitting here just going like, you're 7, like calm down. It's like, just have fun. But then I'm also just like happy that they, you know, that they have these choices and that they can like read all these books. But I definitely get excited when honestly, it doesn't even have to be a book that I worked on. Just like seeing kids out in public spaces reading books. It's something that like whenever, especially if it's a book that like just came out, if I haven't read it, because then I'll be like looking at it being like, oh, maybe I should check this book out. Like, you know, I'm getting my reading tips from what I see kids reading on the subway when I used to commute.
Kiara?
Yeah, similar to what everyone said. Well, not similar because we had two opposing views. I get excited. I specifically love editorial staff. We get to be behind the booth in New York Comic Con, and I always say in my past life I would have done marketing if I didn't do editing. I definitely feel like I'm in the right place, but I love getting like to do it for a little bit, like a few hours. I get to sell our books and like see what kids literally pick up, like if they even flip the cover open and things like that. It's like it is a bit frightening because there are certain books that I really want, like I'm biased of course, and I want to do well and I want kids to be attracted to, but I can see like covers work in action and things like that. And I specifically remember, this wasn't a kid, but it was a parent. I was reading when Real Friends came out. I was reading Real Friends on the subway, and this dad next to me was staring at me, and he was like, can you tell me like what this book is so I can get it from my daughter? And I'm like, this is amazing. Like seeing it work, there's no other feeling.
Okay, here's a little bit of a tricky question for you. So imagine you are editing a book with a child, or maybe your younger self. Like, how do you think that would go? Like, what kind of input do you think they would give you if you were actually working with the audience to edit a book? Rose? I notice everybody's like, oh, hope she doesn't pick me.
Okay, so I think what would my 12-year-old self give me as advice as I edit? I think it's like make it more exciting. Like I think that it's like the action moment. Like I think that that's what I crave, is the to like lean into the drama. I think that like maybe it's because I'm like a conflict averse person or something, but I think that that's what the story is the drama, and I think that my 12-year-old self would want to pump it up.
Megan?
My 12-year-old self would be like, "Oh, that's not accurate. That's not how that happens. That's not the way these girls would act in my school." So that would be me.
Kiara?
That's actually, yeah, I feel like similarly, I find that a lot of middle grade I love, makes the kids seem a bit more mature than they actually are. And I remember, what was I reading? I think I was reading one of Svetlana's books, Crush maybe. And I as much as I read a lot of middle grade and I love it all for different reasons, but I think I remember with Crush, I paused and I'm like, wow, they really do feel like the kids their age. And I feel like maybe that should be happening more often with things I read, you know? But I was like, wow, they're kind of immature, and that's how it should be.
Whitney?
I mean, I agree with what everyone said. I feel like if I was working with like 10-year-old Whitney, it would probably be like, this isn't accurate, but also where are the cats? Like, can we add more cats? Or like, well, this is my favorite color, so can we just have the book be blue, like all blue and like no other colors? Like, let's just have it be blue. And it would probably be a lot of really bad notes.
Okay, tell me about a book that you've read recently that really, 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 really touched you, really excited you, was just awesome. Whitney?
Okay, so the book that I read recently, I read the first 3 volumes because it's a manga series called Blue Flag, and it's on the Shonen Jump app if anyone wants easy access to it. But you can also get physical volumes. But I started reading it because I was just like, oh, it's like a school comic. Like it seems like school slice of life on Shonen Jump. What are you talking about? Because I'm used to very like action oriented, and it ended up being like this romance triangle love story that ended up just like really resonating like with how I remember feeling, like not how it actually happens in real life, like, but it's how I felt when I was like in that age group. And it's not done yet. It ended on the cliffhanger, and I'm very aggravated about that. So that's probably also why it resonated with me so much, is because like I'm stuck at a cliffhanger, so I'm waiting for them to bring out the next volume. But if anyone's looking for, a book to read that's like both beautiful, has great relationships, and explores, sexual identity, and it's a manga, so I love it, and you can find it on the Shonen Jump app. Blue Flag, it's great.
Rose?
I recently read Snapdragon, and absolutely loved it. So good, really, really. Yeah, no, it's so magical. Like, and I think that like I love like when spooky gets done like that, like in a way that was like so atmospheric and spot on, and like the main character is just like someone you really root for, and the character relationships there are just like extremely magical. Loved it.
Kiara?
I've been talking. My choice is not Snapdragon because I keep picking it because I've been talking about this book for a year and a half now. Like, pretty narcissistic. I am sorry, but it was like the best thing I had read in the last 2 years. Actually, I would pick. As you can tell, I'm not reading much outside of our list. Oh my God, A Map to the Sun. So the reason why I pick A Map to the Sun is because I very rarely do I see girl stories be told by like an urban setting, like a gritty urban setting. And I grew up in a gritty urban setting. I'm from the hood, and a lot of what I read is like suburbia. Like, this is awesome too. Like, I find ways to connect, but there was ways in the way that A Map to the Sun was gritty and really nothing was solved at the end because life is really messy that I really related to. And I'm very happy to have that book out there in the market for people that grew up in similar situations.
Megan?
When Stars Are Scattered by Victoria Jameson and Omar Mohammed. It's a memoir. It's of Omar's experience as a Somali refugee growing up in a refugee camp in Kenya. And it was just very, very powerful. He had a neurodiverse brother as well along at his side. He was orphaned. It was just one of the most moving stories I have read in a very, very long time. And it was so compelling, a page turner, and it was true. And I think it was just like a story that gives you, and I read this like during COVID when everyone's like down on how terrible life is, and you just read what somebody else experiences in life, and it gives you, perspective on the world, on life, on different cultures. So I think that is a book that everyone should read. I can't speak highly enough of it.
All right, so let's wrap things up with you telling us about a book that you're really excited about that's coming out from your place. So let's start with Rose.
Well, yes, Lightfall by Tim Probert just came out on 2 weeks ago. So does that count? It came out 2 weeks ago. Really excited about it. It's a fantasy. It's the beginning of a fantasy series about this girl, Bee, who lives in this magical world, Urpa, where it's lit by these big lights in like as opposed to the sun. And there's like there's a mystery. There's magic. It's the most like beautiful artwork ever, and just like such an exciting adventure story. Highly recommend.
Megan?
We also had a book come out 2 weeks ago. It's called Forget Me Nat. It's a follow-up to Nat Enough by Maria Scrivan, and it's just funny. And it's the story of this girl, Natalie, she's recovering from her first heartbreak, and it's just a really touching story about the power of friendship and what you might give up when you're, lusting after somebody, and then the inevitable like loss and isolation when that ends. And it's kind of about remembering who you are and that you yourself form your identity, that it's not contingent upon somebody else or the way somebody else feels about you. So it's funny, but it conveys such a heartfelt message as well.
Whitney?
We have a book coming out in a few weeks called The Magic Fish by Trung Le Nguyen, and it is it's a YA graphic novel. It's amazing. It's about following this young boy Tien as he is struggling with how to communicate with his parents, who are first generation Vietnamese American, but they came over to the U.S. and they're still learning English. And he's trying to figure out how to communicate with them that he's gay. And while at the same time, like his parents are going through their own struggle for like their identity of like, are they like with the new home versus what they left behind? And it's all told with intercuts of fairy tales between, because one of the things that they do is that they read fairy tales to each other to help them both to basically learn English, is they read fairy tales. And so in between all these moments between the characters, you have these fairy tales going on, and it's just this really beautiful, touching story, and Trung's art is amazing, and it's just something I hope you all enjoy when it comes out.
Kiara?
I was toggling between two, but I'm gonna pick Shadow Life by Hiromi Goto and definitely gonna say her name wrong. Maybe. And it's it's an adult book about this elderly woman, this spunky elderly woman who runs away from the home that her daughters put her in to like a bachelor pad because she wants to live life how she lives it. And it's really good. And in her living her peaceful life, she has a run-in with death. Death comes to collect her, and she fights it with a vacuum, and wins for now. She has to gather the friends she's made and past friends that she has to be able to defeat death for sure. And it's also gay, so it's wonderful.
All right. I think we can wrap it up around now. Thank you all so much. That's really amazing. Looking forward to checking out everything that you have coming and all your recommendations. And we'll see you around.
Yeah,
Not
thank
sure how we're
you.
doing.
Bye.